Okay, morena, no mai haere maias. It's 9 a.m, so we'll kick things off. Welcome to this open Zoom session looking at the Transport chapter of the Commission's draft advice to government on the second emissions reduction plan. Ko Alexandra Amos-Eaton toko ingoa. I'm the acting manager of the Buildings, Industry, Transport and Energy team at the Climate Change Commission and the facilitator of today's session. I'll just hand over to Bevan for a karakia to open us up.
Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou I runga I te pāka whakāta reo. Anei te karakia tīmatanga. Paua ki runga, paua ki raro. Ruia, tuia, kōkiritia. Kia mau, kia au, kia ora ai. He pikinga ki te rangi, kia tui tai ao. He pau e hora, he pau a rangi. Kia hora a papa, haumi e hui e, tai ki. So this karakia speaks to our name, He Pauarangi. It communicates the sacred bond between Papa Tuanuku and Ranginui, the sky and the earth. And it speaks of our duty to restore balance from human transgressions. A pau can represent support, a metaphoric post or a gathering of people to support a cause, or to put a stake in the ground. Kōkiritia is to champion a cause, and hora is to make public and put on display, which is part of what we're doing with our consultation. So, tēnā koutou, thank you.
Thanks, Bevan. So the Commission began public consultation on our draft advice to government on 26th of April. This consultation will run for 8 weeks until 20 June. The purpose of today's session is for the Commission to outline our Transport chapter and advice. It's also an opportunity for you to ask questions and clarifications so that you're in a more well-informed position to submit your views as part of this consultation. Engagement is the heart of what we do, and your submissions will help the Commission to improve and strengthen our advice to government. Now, just some housekeeping before we get started. In the chat, please write your ingoa, your name, the community or organisation you represent, and where you are in Aotearoa. It's always nice to see where people are in writing when we can't see your faces. So today's session is split into two sections. In the first section, the team will talk you through the work and recommendations for about 20 minutes. In the second section, there'll be time for Q&A with the team. Please write your questions into the question and answer box rather than the general chat. If we receive lots of questions on the same topic, we may paraphrase, so please don't be offended if your exact question doesn't get asked. We'll be recording this session and making it available on our website later, along with all of the other open Zoom sessions on other chapters. So enough from me, over to Danny and the Transport team to take us through this session.
Thanks, Ali and Bevan. I also want to thank everyone for joining the Zoom. Transport in particular is an area of our advice that will affect all New Zealanders every day. So we really appreciate you attending, especially at this 9 a.m. start, and also for those, thank those that will watch later. The input from this consultation will strengthen and improve our final advice to government. In terms of structure this morning, I'm going to provide some context for the Commission's work and for the transport sector as a whole. I'll also speak to the first transport recommendation around increasing walking, cycling and public transport. Next, my colleague Hugh will speak to the light vehicle fleet and our recommendation there. And then Katie will speak to freight and commercial vehicles and our third recommendation. There should be plenty of time for Q&A after that. So first, with this slide, a reminder of the role of the Climate Change Commission. We're an independent Crown entity. We provide regular, independent and evidence-based advice to government on climate issues. Our advice is based on the science, evidence and analysis carried out by our experts on staff and, importantly, based on input from stakeholders and the people of Aotearoa New Zealand. As part of our independence, the conclusions and recommendations of the Commission are made by our board, not a government minister or cabinet. Next slide, thanks. The Commission's role and tasks are set out in the Climate Change Response Act. This slide shows the advice we're required to give over the next 2 years. Today's session focuses on the item there in red, our draft advice to inform the strategic direction of the government's second emissions reduction plan. This plan will cover the years 2026 to 2030, but also beyond. Our final advice is due by the end of the year. It will then be the role of government to consider our advice and for it to decide on the specific policy choices to include in the next emissions reduction plan. This is the second time the Commission has provided advice to government for an emissions reduction plan. And our advice looks a little bit different now as the context has changed. Firstly, the government has set an overall emissions budget for 2026 to 2030. Our advice here is about the direction of policy to achieve that, not about what the budget should be. Given this, our draft advice is less about modelling and emissions projections as it was last time, and is more focused on the direction of policy. The second key development is that the government has made its first emissions reduction plan. This covers the period we're currently in now, up until 2025. It contains around 400 actions, and as we know, it's still very much being implemented. So given this, our draft advice is focused on building on the work already progressing and not reiterating all of our previous advice. To manage this, we have used a prioritisation framework. It draws on the Act to decide which elements of our advice to raise as specific recommendations. This framework includes the potential for the action to reduce emissions, gaps in policy, the pace and timing of the action, risks to realising the emissions budget, equity considerations, and finally, what co-benefits does the action bring? Overall, the Commission has landed on 19 recommendations for this advice, 3 of which are in transport. This is fewer recommendations than last time, but in the view of the Board and the Commission, they're more strategic and more focused. As Ali mentioned at the start, we're consulting with the public on our draft advice for 8 weeks. We'll then analyse those submissions and use this to adjust and improve our final advice. On to transport. So as I said earlier, transport is fundamental for New Zealanders every day. How we connect with friends, families and communities, but also for a thriving economy. It is, however, a major source of emissions in New Zealand. It was 17% of gross emissions and 29% of long-lived gas emissions in 2020. Most of these emissions come from road transport, more than 90%. Around 5% are from domestic aviation, followed by shipping and rail. The graph on the screen here gives a picture of the emissions reductions that are targeted over the first 3 emissions budget periods. This is based on the government's targets. We know that meeting the emissions budget will require action over all sectors, but if we look at transport in particular, we see the contribution scale up significantly from the first to the second, and from the second to the third emissions budget. That's the bars on the left. The reason for this is the lag time between actions taken now and actual emissions reductions. If we think of things like the time for infrastructure to be built, for changes to the way we design our cities, and for EV uptake to progressively displace fossil fuel vehicles from our vehicle fleet. What's critical here is that actions taken in the second emissions budget period are essential for setting up the next period. This has framed our thinking and our recommendations. Next slide. So to achieve this, we know that the transport system will need change at all levels to provide New Zealanders with safe, affordable and reliable low emissions transport options. Another really important piece of context is that decarbonising transport can also help improve the health, well-being and equity of New Zealanders. As one example, we've got a graph here from some recent research that looks into the social costs of health impacts from air pollution. We can see that the vast majority of this comes from our fossil-fueled motor vehicles, with the costs being well over 10 billion every year. We also know that there'll be other positive impacts if we decarbonise transport well. Reduced harm and deaths from motor vehicles, improved health from greater levels of active transport. With this context in mind, we have 3 key recommendations that target different elements of the transport system. Our first transport-specific recommendation focuses on ensuring we have a transport system that optimises public and active transport. A key enabler for this is how we build and design our cities. The planning for transport and urban development needs to be integrated. We have a recommendation on how we design our cities as part of the built environment chapter of our advice. If you're particularly interested in that, there will be a separate Zoom next week, but I've also included that recommendation on the next slide. We also know that New Zealand has pretty low levels of active and public transport compared to similar countries. It's around about 5% of the distance people travel. To grow this, we need safe and dedicated spaces for walking, cycling and public transport. However, transport infrastructure and services have been underfunded, especially that which supports safe walking, cycling and public transport. This is even though the costs of walking, cycling and public transport infrastructure are generally much lower on a per person basis compared with roads. The planning and funding system for transport is also slow and fragmented. When we look at major public transport projects, there's no consistent approach to funding between central and local government. And we also need greater clarity about what local government authorities are expected to deliver to reduce transport emissions. Pressure is also building on the consenting system, which has the potential to threaten at least 1/3 of the emissions reduction projects required to meet targets across transport and also the energy sector. Given all this, in our draft advice, we recommend that the government simplify planning and increase funding of integrated transport networks that optimise public and active transport. We also know that the greatest opportunity to reduce emissions through these means are in our major population centres. As an example, Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch together generate over 1/3 of the national light vehicle kilometres travelled. When you add in the other major population centres, this increases to about 65% of all light vehicle kilometres travelled. Because of that, to focus the infrastructure development where the potential is greatest, we are also recommending that for major population centres, the government should complete cycle networks by 2030 and take steps to complete rapid transport networks by 2035. I've also included here the built environment recommendation from the other chapter for your reference. That's it for this section. I'll now pass on to Hugh to take you through the next part of our advice.
Thanks, Danny. So Alongside increasing walking, cycling and public transport, transitioning to zero or low emissions technologies will play a critical role in decarbonising transport in Aotearoa New Zealand, particularly outside of our urban centres where there's no safe or reliable alternatives to cars. In 2020, light vehicles, that's all vehicles under 3.5 tonnes, contributed 65% of transport emissions. That's 8.6 megatons of CO2 equivalent from the light fleet alone. Decarbonising the light fleet requires a rapid and sustained growth in EV sales. In our demonstration path, the share of EVs entering the New Zealand fleet, shown in green in the line here, in the green line, grows from 11.5% in 2025 to 67% in 2030. It reaches 100% by 2035. That means that 100% of cars, utes, vans and SUVs entering New Zealand, whether new or second-hand, are electric in 2035. It's worth noting that current uptake, shown in orange in the chart, is already exceeding our demonstration pathway. A challenge in the second emissions budget period, 2026 to 2030, will be ensuring that all New Zealanders who want to buy an EV are able to access them. Targeted support for low-income and disadvantaged groups will ensure that an equitable transition to a zero emissions fleet. Especially because in this period, the supply of used second-hand vehicles from overseas might be constrained. And that's because EV uptake in key supplier countries like Japan has been pretty slow. Next slide, please. Another challenge we see for this period is charging infrastructure, both public and private. During our initial engagement for this advice, many stakeholders said that the main constraint for EV uptake during the second emissions budget period would be sufficient vehicle charging infrastructure, not access to low emission vehicles. If we don't remove these barriers to charging and scaling up both a nationwide public charging network and sufficient private charging capacity, it will likely constrain EV uptake in the second emissions budget period. And this will limit the contribution that electric vehicles can make to achieving emissions budgets 2 and beyond. Some of the issues with charging are shared across the energy sector, and they're addressed in the proposed recommendation around the pace and scale of electricity infrastructure development. If you're interested, you can find the recording of the Zoom session that we had yesterday on our website. Other barriers to charging are transport specific, like ensuring that renters and people without dedicated parks can access charging. Our draft recommendation to government is that they rapidly resolve barriers to scaling up vehicle charging infrastructure. That's the end of my section. I'll hand over for Katie for the freight and commercial vehicles.
Kia ora. Thanks, Hugh. So the freight sector is essential to Aotearoa's economy, both domestically for moving goods around the country, as well as for enabling our exports to overseas markets. Currently, Aotearoa's freight is predominantly moved by road, about 75% on a tonnes per kilometre basis. Heavy vehicles are categorised as those weighing over 3.5 tonne, much of these heavy vehicles are involved with delivering freight around the country that I spoke about. Heavy vehicles make up around 4% of the transport fleet, but contributed 25% of road transport emissions in 2020. These heavy vehicles, combined with light commercial vehicles, which made up 24% of the emissions in 2020, contributed to nearly half of all road transport emissions. So you can see this proportion of emissions depicted in the graphs in the slide here. There are a significant number of barriers to decarbonising these types of vehicles. This includes higher capital costs, limited vehicle supply, and lack of adequate charging and other supporting infrastructure. There are anticipated to be more zero emission models available on the global market of these vehicle classes in that second emissions budget period, 2026 to 2030. Enabling actions that target these vehicles will help to quickly reduce our transport emissions. Rail and coastal shipping modes service fewer destinations than road freight, but they are known lower emission freight modes. Continued support of rail and coastal shipping will create more resilience in the freight network in the face of climate impacts, like we saw in Cyclone Gabrielle with the damage to our roading network. Aviation, as well as delivering high-value freight, connects passengers quickly across regions in Aotearoa. Creating an enabling environment to support the introduction of low and zero emissions aircraft anticipated from 2030, as well as securing supply for sustainably sourced bio-based aviation fuels, will be important in the second emissions budget for decarbonising the aviation sector. So with all of these considerations, we recommend that the emissions reduction plan for the second budget period must develop incentives to accelerate the uptake of zero emission commercial vehicles, including vans, utes, and trucks. Policy support and incentives are needed to address these barriers mentioned in the previous slide to decarbonising these types of vehicles and enable an increased uptake of the zero emission alternatives. That concludes the section on focusing on freight and commercial vehicles. I will now hand back over to Ali to facilitate our questions and answers.
Oh, awesome, thanks guys. Just to remind to everyone to put your questions in the Q&A box and we can work our way through them. So while I'm waiting for some to come through, I might just quickly ask Danny to talk through. You talked earlier on in the presentation about the differences between, in generally with Aotearoa Nei and this current advice, but can you talk us through a little bit more how transport looks different to that previous advice?
Sure thing, Ali. When we gave our advice to the government about their first emissions reduction plan, which we called an Aotearoa Nei, one of the key things there was really about setting in place a lot of the architecture and I guess the shifts in thinking about how we need to decarbonise New Zealand. So at that stage, there was quite a few elements around changing kind of strategic direction. In transport, we talked about needing a national plan and targets for walking, cycling, public transport, about having a national freight strategy as well to kind of ensure that the different elements of freight were kind of aligned in a way that would reduce emissions. When we look at the advice that we're giving now, there's very much been a shift to focus on delivery. What are the actual ways we can reduce emissions once all of those kind of enabling levers are in place? So for instance, when we talk about the first section there around walking, cycling, and public transport, we've included in our advice some like specific infrastructure and deadlines that we'd like to see achieved in the second and also in the third emissions budget period. When we look at the light vehicle fleet, initially it was about getting uptake of EVs kind of kicked off in New Zealand, and that's where we're seeing some incentives introduced. Looking ahead, it's very much more around like that kind of infrastructure around charging that's going to deliver change. And similar, I guess, with freight, there's a shift from demonstration projects to incentives across the board. So that's kind of some of the key, I guess, change in emphasis from our first advice to our second advice. One thing I would add, though, at one level is for transport, we've actually structured our advice in a pretty similar way. And that's because we know what most of the solutions are and will be in transport. We know what the technologies are. It's really a matter of getting on and delivering those changes at pace. It's only been a little over 2 years since we gave our last advice. So the technologies are there, costs are coming down, but what we really need to see is like the pace and timing of delivery significantly increased.
Yeah, nice, thank you. I've got a question here. This might be for you again, Danny, or maybe you might be able to chip in as well. But any thoughts on how to reduce light vehicle use in rural areas? So the person who's asking the question is saying, in Northland, our population is split 50-50 between urban and rural.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, it's one of the big challenges, right? We know that we need to decarbonise the whole transport system. Part of what we have focused on is very much where the major potential is, and that is why you have seen a focus in terms of the major population areas for things like public transport, where it's a lot harder to deliver that in less densely populated areas. Part of our advice that is, I guess, a section that wasn't covered off in our slides. We also talk about some of the other ways that you can provide options in less urban areas that are not just comprehensive public transport system and walking and cycling infrastructure. So, for instance, that talked about some of the more innovative on-demand public transport. There's been a few examples like this that have been trialled around the country, where it's not practical to provide a full comprehensive public transport. These more sort of on-demand options can fill that gap. Similar with some, so we've talked about there providing some support for those elements. One of the other parts of the picture has to be around electrifying vehicles. And it's quite interesting in some ways that a lot of the constraints around EV uptake that we've talked about, lack of off-street parking in dense urban areas, there's some really good examples overseas of where actually rural areas are leading the uptake of electric vehicles because some of those challenges are not there. So that's also kind of an element that we touch on in our advice. But I think part of this consultation process is we would definitely welcome, advice and evidence and views on perhaps the gaps in our advice and where sort of there needs to be greater emphasis and priority with, for example, the situation of, say, Northland and lots of our other rural areas as well. I'm not sure if any of the other team members have elements they want to chip in on that, but that'll be some of my initial thoughts.
No, I think that's perfect. Thank you, Danny. I think we might, given that you've spoken a bit about EVs there too, our next question actually relates to EVs. So Hugh, this one's coming for you. So there is quite a lot of focus in the advice on EVs, which can perpetuate car dependency. The question is, aren't you just pushing emissions offshore where mining and production of EVs takes place? And aren't EVs bad for the environment?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. So, yeah, I think when you take into account like the full supply chain, including like raw mineral extraction, battery manufacture, vehicle manufacturer, shipping to New Zealand, and then their use within New Zealand. So an EV over its whole life cycle emits 60% less emissions than an equivalent new internal combustion engine. And that figure's kind of old. We probably need some more evidence on this, but at 60%, as the electricity system continues to decarbonize, we're going to see that figure even come down even further. So EVs do reduce emissions, both locally and globally. And the government can also implement complementary policies to reduce car dependency, as we've sort of spoke about quite a bit. Designing more compact, walkable communities, making people less reliant on cars. I might hand over to Danny if he wants to comment further on that, but yeah.
I think you've done a pretty good job, Hugh.
Okay, sweet.
I mean, one of the other elements, I guess, that's worth emphasising, we know that we need to phase out fossil fuel vehicles from New Zealand. And there are different pathways of doing that. So one of them that we've talked about is electric vehicles, and that's going to play a key role. On the other side, there's also the changes to public transport, how we build and design our cities, and shifting to higher rates of walking, cycling, public transport where that's available. That's also going to have an impact on reducing the overall need for, or I guess the only option being driving private vehicles. So there's kind of a combination of those two factors that are going to work to eliminate fossil fuel vehicles from the fleet. And I think there's a bit of tension between those two, but that needs to be, that's a key part of the pathway out to 2050.
Cool, thanks Danny and Hugh. Okay, so this question is actually about something that we haven't spoken about much today, or at all, I don't think. And are you able to, Katie, tell us about what the role of hydrogen is in transport?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. Thank you. That's a great question. Although not explicitly explained in our slides there are some examples of hydrogen being used as a fuel in the transport sector. Definitely some demonstration examples in New Zealand, and we've seen that growing, particularly hydrogen fuel cell for our heavy electric fleet. Hydrogen fuel cell electric for the heavy fleet, and also some anticipated hydrogen aircraft as well for our short haul domestic. So there may be a niche for green hydrogen in heavy freight trips that are long and heavy, where batteries come at the expense of carrying payload, and the downtime for charging could impact efficiency as well. For aviation and shipping, the decarbonisation pathways for those are less clear, although there are some models being seen for some hydrogen aircraft, but it's not fully yet clear what the technologies and all the low emission fuel types will be for those. So hydrogen may play some role in this. There's also potential future uses of hydrogen where electrification would struggle, like remote vehicles and machinery, although not specifically in our transport greenhouse gas inventory. From our analysis though, battery electric vehicles are looking to be able to support a lot of the freight operations and our freight fleet here in New Zealand. Hence why we've kind of focused on electrification and our two relevant recommendations in the transport chapter. We do have some more detail on the role of hydrogen, also in our energy and industry chapter, so the greater role of hydrogen. So I would encourage you to read that section, and also we would encourage any evidence during consultation about evidence for hydrogen use in the transport sector as well.
Awesome, thanks Katie. So the next question relates a little bit to the earlier question about rural. What about the lack of low emission models for utes, SUVs and vans? Danny, maybe you have a first go at that one.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this question, I guess, our third recommendation talks about introducing incentives to accelerate the uptake of what we've called commercial vehicles. So this includes like the really heavy trucks, but also things like vans and utes. And, you know, one of the critical elements for that is when we think of a lot of these commercial vehicles end up traveling long distances. You think of courier vans that are traveling sort of all day, every day, as opposed to, say, a private vehicle that might spend most of the time sort of either parked in the garage or parked somewhere. So that's part of the reason why we're focusing on these types of vehicles, where there's a real potential for each one that is substituted for a zero emissions vehicle. There's a greater impact on our emissions reduction. With this advice, you know, we're focused on that period 2026 to 2030, and from our, I guess, international scan of what car producers and vehicle producers have committed to and the models that are coming forth, we are actually expecting to see a lot more electric and low emissions models coming available globally. I think in our advice we talk about at least 300 models of these heavier vehicle types by the start of the next emissions budget period. So we're expecting to see more low and zero emissions models available, but also the price continuing to come down as well. So yeah, forecasting out ahead, that kind of supply issue we think is going to be a lot less constrained than it is now.
Yeah, Danny, I might just add a little bit there. You know, the pathway that we're sort of proposing here is sort of pretty and well in line with other countries. The European Union, the UK, all announced similar bans or targets. And so, you know, as global auto manufacturers develop models to serve those markets, we'll be able to access them. So that we're not out of step with other countries.
Yeah, thanks guys. Okay, Hugh, actually this is another follow-up question for you about, I think it's just a little bit further detail than the earlier question. The question is around life cycle emissions associated with EVs. It comes up frequently as a concern. Can you recommend any robust studies that compare LCA emissions of ICE versus a battery electric vehicle? And is there any analysis based on the current New Zealand fleet?
Yes. There is a few studies. The one that comes to mind being the most comprehensive was the ECA one that was done 2016, I think. It's but there are a few newer ones as well from a few academics in New Zealand. Is that the, yeah.
Yep.
That's about it.
That's perfect, thank you. Okay, next question, I think possibly back to you, Danny. Given the importance of behaviour change and mode shift aspect of the complementary policies, i.e. rapid investment in rail infrastructure for both public and freight transport, shouldn't these also come into the recommendations?
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, I guess I'll focus particularly on the rail element of that. And it's obviously, you know, there might be a few people in the audience who've seen some of the news around interregional passenger rail and some of the protests that have been happening. So it might be kind of top of mind for a few others. In terms of our advice, rail, passenger and freight definitely plays a role in decarbonising transport in New Zealand. In the first recommendation that's up here in terms of the rapid transit networks, so that definitely can, so we're prioritising in terms of within our major population centres. Commuter rail, basically, definitely can be included, or it's definitely part of that solution when we talk about completing rapid transit networks by 2035. So it could be, dedicated bus lanes, but it could very much also be light rail. So when we're talking about here, simplifying planning, increasing funding of integrated transport networks, for our draft advice, that very much would include inner city rail as one of the solutions. We've also, as Katie mentioned, talked about freight on rail, and we do know that that is an option that has, it's a lower emissions form of moving freight than our, say, diesel fuel trucks. And so we've talked about our advice, the need for some continued support for that. There are definitely, though, limitations in where the rail freight network is able to service. And, from our research and analysis, this places a bit of a constraint around like what the potential is to shift freight off our roads and onto rail. What we have specifically said, though, in our advice is that in the government's, I think it's called Freight and Supply Chain Strategy, that's under development at the moment, one of the key things in that will need to be identifying what the barriers are to, identifying what the barriers are and the potential to shift freight to rail and to maximise that. But it's only going to be part of the solution for moving freight around New Zealand. And so that's why we've also very much got this other recommendation that looks around commercial vehicles, including trucks and so forth. So, and actually, while I remember, there's also been a parliamentary inquiry into passenger rail between cities, into regional passenger rail. And we're going to have a really good look at the findings of that when that comes out. It wasn't completed in the stages that we've been developing this draft advice. So we certainly also welcome advice and submissions as part of this process around what the potential is for those forms of rail as well. Yeah.
Cool, thanks, Danny. So I think this question actually might have been answered in a written answer, but I think it's worth having a quick discussion about it. So the question is, how many times has the Climate Commission's demonstration path been updated, and do we plan to update it in the future?
Sure, I can respond to that, and you can correct me if need be. I guess as part of the context of this, the demonstration path was part of the modelling that we did for our first piece of advice to government, and it formed a really key piece of evidence and analysis for our recommendations on what should be the emissions budgets for the 5-year blocks out to 2050. The demonstration path sort of analysis was actually then adopted almost entirely by government in setting its targets for the emissions budgets. We haven't updated the demonstration path for this piece of advice because it's very much focused on the direction of policy, as I mentioned it earlier with the budget set. We did update our demonstration path last year as part of some of the advice we were required to give the government on the emissions trading scheme settings. And if you actually, there's a slide earlier on that talks about the different pieces of advice that the Commission will be providing over the next 2 years. And one of those is about what is the, what should be the fourth emissions budget. There we go, that's that third last line there. So that piece of advice is due at the end of next year, and the demonstration path and our modelling will be updated as part of that.
Cool, yeah.
Hugh's also one of our modellers, so I don't know if there's anything you want to add in on that.
No, I think you've covered it, Danny.
You nailed it, thanks, Danny.
Yeah.
Okay, Katie, back to you for one. Well, we often discuss what fuels are required to decarbonise shipping and aviation. Has any consideration been given to what infrastructure changes would be required to decarbonise maritime transport and support greener ships coming in from overseas?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. So, although not a central focus of our advice, we do include in there, we know from stakeholders that there does need to be that continued investment for coastal shipping, for upgrading port infrastructure, not even for the greener ships, but also we're anticipating larger ships coming in from overseas, and larger freight volumes will also be significant as population grows and freight volumes grows with it. So we have included that, and particularly with the coastal shipping funding that is coming from our National Land Transport Fund, and we know that some of those went to projects that were supporting some of the port infrastructure changes there, that will continue to be important. Our coastal shipping fleet is obviously reasonably small, and we're quite efficient now. So although that wasn't a central focus, we have included the importance of the infrastructure as we are reliant on our international ships as well, vessels coming in. I don't know if either of my colleagues want to speak more to that.
Thanks, Patty. A couple of things to add from me. Brianna, are you able to scroll back to that list of advice over the next 2 years? Thanks. So the Commission has actually got a specific piece of advice that we are required to deliver. It's that second last line there, which is a review of whether emissions from international shipping and international aviation should be included in the 2050 target that's currently in the Climate Change Response Act. So currently, these emissions are not part of our target, which reflects kind of the international architecture where it's a lot more challenging to sort of assign responsibility for these emissions, where they're very much shared between the countries involved. They are reported, but they're not included within, say, the domestic calculation of New Zealand's emissions. This piece of advice is due at the end of next year, and the Commission will need to give advice to government on whether that should change, whether emissions from international shipping and aviation should be included in the 2050 target. Of note, we have actually got a call for evidence out at the moment to inform part of that process. So we are seeking through that evidence that's related to that specific project, which has not been included in this particular advice. But then one other thing I will add, and this again kind of relates to our energy and industry chapter, where we've got a recommendation around addressing some of the challenges to our transmission and distribution lines. So when we think about the different technologies that are likely to decarbonise shipping and aviation, one of the options is around electrification. And so there will be need for upgraded infrastructure and I guess capacity for that that high capacity charging to airports, to ports as well. And so very much the recommendation we've made there around addressing barriers to energy and the grid will need to be addressed as part of that.
Yes, absolutely. It's all about supporting the electrification of transport. Okay, Hugh, back to you. It's another life cycle type question. So do the carbon calculations consider the emissions involved in the production and disposal of EVs, or just the emissions during the lifespan of use and travel? For example, what is the emission profile of the production and disposal / recycling of EVs versus ICEs?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here that I think worth mentioning. So in terms of what we consider as in our budgets and informing our budgets, is we consider only production emissions. So that's emissions that occur within New Zealand. That said, and referring back to that study that I referred to, like when we developed our advice around electric vehicles and that sort of thing, we took into consideration, the life cycle impact, and that's that production and disposal of the vehicle as well as the use. And that's the 60% reduction figure that I quoted. But within our budgets, it's simply the use.
Wonderful.
Perhaps one other just additional element to that. There's also opportunities to use batteries from electric vehicles at the end of their life as their suitable life as an EV. And yeah, there's already been some good examples of basically sort of a second life or a second use of those batteries in ways where it's perhaps not as critical. You're not the examples I'm thinking of are around like battery use in rural areas related to like the electricity system. So we have talked about some elements of that in the chapters we refer to around like circular economy. And so, yeah, just because the vehicles associated with EVs are no longer suitable for that purpose doesn't mean that there aren't still really useful uses for them that can support decarbonising New Zealand.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing around, an electric vehicle needs to have a very energy dense battery to give you the range. But
that's right, yeah.
It degrades to a certain level where it's no longer super suitable for, daily driving or, what people need it for. And then at that point, it's still a very useful battery and it has a large capacity left. You can repurpose it for a place where, space is not so constrained as it is in a vehicle.
Yeah, excellent point. Thanks, Hugh. Okay, well, we've actually worked our way through all of our questions now. Brianna, are you able to put out the consultation slide? So thank you all for your time today and your thoughtful questions. So this is just a final reminder that public consultation will close on the 20th of June. Our draft advice, as well as this recording for this Zoom and all of our other ones relating to the other chapters, will be available on the Commission website. And we look forward to receiving your submissions through our Citizen Space consultation portal. I'll now pass to Bevan, who will close us out with a karakia.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou whai wahi I tēnei rā, anei te karakia whakamutunga. Ka hiki te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūruki ai te ao marama, haumi e hui e, tai. So just for those who want a translation of that, restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities enriched and unified. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.